In the closing months of the Second World War, as nations scrambled to seize the spoils of a collapsing empire, entire divisions, documents, and truths vanished into the smoke. What remained were fragments, declassified memos, intercepted transmissions, and redacted testimonies that hinted at operations too costly to expose. Beneath the official history of victory and liberation, there exists a second war, a silent conflict fought in laboratories, tunnels, and sealed archives. This is the war that never ended, a war of secrets buried beneath treaties and decades of silence. Somewhere in those missing pages lies the real story of how far the Allies and their enemies were willing to go. Chapter 1. Operation Eclipse, the Vanishing of Division 731. In August 1945, as Soviet armored columns swept through Manchuria, entire sectors of Japanese military command dissolved into radio silence. Among them was the most closely guarded facility in the Imperial Army's history, the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, better known to Allied intelligence as Unit 731. For months, American intercepts had tracked the division's activities, coded shipments from Harbin, encrypted cables between Pingfang and Tokyo, and orders signed only by Lieutenant General Ishii. Then, as the Red Army reached the outskirts of Harbin on August 15th, every frequency tied to the unit went dead. Soviet scouts found charred compounds, piles of incinerated files, and hastily filled mass graves, but no personnel, no prisoners, no conclusive record that the unit had ever existed. In the first debriefings at Yokohama, US Army interrogators began collecting rumors from captured Japanese officers. One mentioned a last-minute evacuation convoy, trains marked with the chrysanthemum crest that departed Pingfang under medical quarantine. Another, a former Kempitai courier, described a detour through Port Arthur, sealed freight cars guarded by men with no insignia, and orders stamped Eclipse. The code word matched an obscure reference in intercepted Allied communications from early 1946, Operation Eclipse, assets in transit, priority under MacArthur jurisdiction. The documents never surfaced in post-war tribunals. By 1947, fragments of the unit's research began to reappear in unexpected places. A memo from the US Army Chemical Corps mentioned data on human hypothermia survivability tests, Pingfang origin. Another, labeled Top Secret, Fort Detrick Review, described biological samples in sealed cryocanisters retrieved from non-Soviet custody. When congressional investigators requested clarification, the files were abruptly reclassified under the Joint Security Agreement of 1949. It was as if the entire record of Japan's wartime biological experimentation had been absorbed into an invisible American project. The few surviving Japanese technicians, captured by Soviet intelligence, were interrogated at Khabarovsk in December 1949. Transcripts from those trials, long dismissed as propaganda, contained details that matched declassified American documents decades later. The Soviets alleged that Ishii Shiro, the unit's commanding officer, had been granted immunity in exchange for transferring his research to US authorities. The Americans denied it, but declassified cables from the same period include a curious note. Special Scientific Detachment 45 to receive transferred biological intelligence personnel, priority extraction via Yokohama port, cover designation, agricultural research. What happened to those men after 1947 remains one of the most carefully erased threads in the post-war intelligence web. Some sources claim they resurfaced under new names in Maryland, attached to a joint biodefense program at Camp Detrick. Others insist they were sent to Korea during the early days of the war, where reports of mystery fevers among North Korean troops mirrored symptoms from the Pingfang experiments. None of these allegations were ever officially acknowledged, but fragments of budgetary ledgers from the Department of Defense list unexplained allocations to Project N9E, Cold Region Pathogen Containment. In 1958, a former Army medical officer, Captain Robert Hayes, submitted a classified report titled The Eclipse Memorandum. He described reviewing film reels recovered from Japan, grainy footage of human subjects exposed to frostbite, decompression, and bacterial aerosols. Hayes claimed the reels bore US archival markings added post-war. The memo was buried under Section 219 of the War Crimes Disclosure Act and only surfaced in partial form in 1998. The pages that remain show references to Fort Detrick assimilation of Unit 731 dataset and Subject Index translated from Japanese logs, 1943-1945. Japanese records corroborate part of this chain. In a surviving fragment of Ishii's diary, found in a Kyoto temple in 1961, he wrote, "I was told our work will live on beyond defeat. The Americans seek knowledge, not justice." His trail ends there. No official record of his death exists, though multiple witnesses claim to have seen him in Tokyo's Shinjuku district as late as 1954. The US Army officially listed him as non-apprehended, presumed deceased. For decades, the name Eclipse resurfaced in scattered intelligence correspondence, mostly as an accounting code or cover term within bioweapons research appropriations. The National Archives hold a memo dated May 12, 1953, from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the Secretary of Defense. Reclassification of Eclipse-derived materials under compartmentalized oversight. No further congressional disclosure recommended. Attached was a receipt for 37 film canisters, 1 medical freezer, and 3 bound ledgers labeled in Japanese. When researchers from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency attempted to cross-reference those serial numbers in 2003, the storage logs were empty. The listed canisters were supposedly destroyed in 1969 under the Nixon Bioweapons Directive. Yet one photograph survives, found in a declassified Fort Detrick slideshow. It shows a wooden crate stamped Eclipse 731 and the faint outline of kanji beneath the paint. The contents remain unidentified. Today, the location of the missing train convoy from Manchuria remains unknown. Soviet-era maps mark an unaccounted railway spur between Harbin and Mudanjiang, which abruptly disappears near the former Japanese garrison at Hailen. Ground-penetrating surveys conducted in 1999 detected metallic anomalies beneath the forest floor, consistent with buried railcars. Chinese authorities have since cordoned off the area, citing unexploded ordnance hazard. No excavation has been permitted. What began as a wartime atrocity became a Cold War bargaining chip. The men of Division 731, the doctors and engineers who vanished in the ashes of surrender, were never tried, never named, and never punished. Their work, however, lived on, filtered through the laboratories of 2 superpowers locked in a race for dominance. Operation Eclipse was not merely an extraction mission. It was a moral erasure, executed in the grey space where scientific ambition eclipsed accountability. Somewhere, in a classified annex of an American archive, the full record may still exist. The names, the data, the unfiltered evidence of how one nation's crimes became another's research foundation. And as long as those files remain sealed, the vanishing of Division 731 is not an accident of history. It is its deliberate rewriting. Chapter 2. The Iron Cross Conspiracy Files. April 1945. Berlin was collapsing under artillery fire as the Reich Chancellery smouldered, and the last remnants of the Wehrmacht fell back, street by street. Amid the chaos, British reconnaissance units attached to the Special Operations Executive, SOE, intercepted a radio transmission from an SS courier division en route to Tempelhof. The message was brief, encrypted using the Enigma variant Green 44, and carried a chilling designation. Eisener Kreuz shipment confirmed. Directive Kammler Argentina via Rome. The name was familiar to Allied intelligence. SS General Hans Kammler, the engineer behind the V2 program, Secret Weapons Division, and construction of the Mittelwerk complex, had already disappeared days earlier, presumed dead. Yet the message implied an ongoing extraction. 3 weeks later, on May 9, 1945, a joint British and American team, Section 9 of the Secret Intelligence Service, raided a Luftwaffe storage facility near Potsdam. Inside, they found 32 steel crates labeled Eisener Kreuz. The contents included thousands of documents, blueprints, correspondence, and transfer ledgers referencing industrial partners in South America, Neutral Europe, and the Vatican Bank. Some were marked with Kammler's signature. Others contained Argentine customs stamps predating Germany's surrender. The operation was logged as File IC 945, later known internally as the Iron Cross Conspiracy. According to the surviving Section 9 brief, the crates were immediately transferred to a secure MI6 depot at Camp 020 Surrey. There they were catalogued by cryptographer Major Peter Ashcroft, who noted recurring references to a Directive Phoenix, a contingency plan for post-war reorganization of SS assets under foreign corporate fronts. One particular dossier referenced an entity called Sociedad del Condor. Established in Buenos Aires in early 1945 under the guise of an agricultural export company, its founders included several names later linked to Nazi intelligence officer, networks that escaped through the Vatican's so-called rat lines, Ashcroft's report emphasized that these routes appeared actively facilitated by clerical intermediaries. In Rome, the documents should have become the centerpiece of post-war tribunals, yet they vanished. MI6's 1953 internal inventory shows file IC 945, transferred to US custody for joint evaluation. The transfer signature belonged to a Colonel Andrew F. Wallace, liaison officer for Operation Paperclip, the American mission responsible for relocating German scientists to US soil. When the British archive was re-audited in 1963, all Iron Cross files were missing. In their place, a single replacement memo stamped Asset Integration Complete with the CIA crest in the corner. Wallace himself was reassigned to the Atomic Energy Commission and died 2 years later in what the coroner described as a vehicular incident. No autopsy was conducted from 1965 to 1972. Rumors persisted of a clandestine group of ex-Wehrmacht scientists operating in Argentina under US contract, working on advanced aeronautics and guided propulsion systems. Journalists in Buenos Aires reported sightings of German engineers in Córdoba and Mendoza provinces, often escorted by Argentine military police. A 1970 cable from the US Embassy in Buenos Aires to the State Department, declassified in 2002, confirms an American technical delegation visiting the Fábrica Militar de Aviones, a facility long suspected of housing ex-Nazi personnel under new identities. The cable's marginalia includes the handwritten phrase, Eisenerkreuz linkage likely, keep reference internal. One of the few remaining insiders to speak publicly about the matter was a retired RAF officer, Flight Lieutenant George Whitby. In a 1981 BBC interview, he recalled guarding a convoy of captured scientists through Hamburg in June 1945. We were told it was part of Operation Backfire, testing V2s, Whitby said. But those men weren't technicians, they were bureaucrats. One carried a Vatican passport. We were told not to record their names. When pressed, he described the convoy's destination as a coastal freighter headed for Antwerp. No British flag, no registry. That freighter has never been traced. Documents recovered in 1995 from the Argentine National Archives under the Freedom of Information Decree include a customs manifest dated July 17, 1946, for the cargo ship Santa Lucia. Among its passengers, A. Keller engineer, R. Baumann, industrialist, and H. Kruger, theologian. British historian Dr. Edward Langstrom cross-referenced these aliases against post-war intelligence rosters, discovering striking similarities with 3 high-ranking SS figures, including Otto Skorzony's logistical aide. Attached to the manifest was an export declaration for machinery and precision tools, value 1.2 million Reichsmarks, an impossible currency figure after Germany's surrender. The name of the exporting entity matched one in Ashcroft's lost ledger, Sociedad del Condor. When CIA archivists reviewed South American operations in 1977, a marginal note in the debriefing of Agent Robert S. Cunningham references Iron Cross intelligence assets integrated into Hemisphere Technical Group. This front organization, based nominally in Houston, was later identified as a contractor for the US Air Force's early rocketry programs. By 1989, its records had been purged, and the company dissolved quietly. Still, traces persist in the paper trail. A declassified OSS microfilm titled Recovered German Scientific Assets includes a blurred photograph of Kammler, time-stamped May 1949, Buenos Aires. Officially, Kammler's death certificate remains dated May 9, 1945, signed by an SS adjutant with no surviving witnesses. The Argentine photograph bears the caption, Dr. Hans K., briefing with American technical attaché. Forensic analysis is inconclusive, but facial mapping yields an 86% match. Even more curious are the Vatican links. The Iron Cross files repeatedly mention Codex A29, believed to reference diplomatic correspondence between Reich, envoys and clerical liaisons in 1944-45. Portions of these letters surfaced during the 1999 Pius Debine document release, including an untranslated Latin note that references the continuation of order through discretion and migration. The cipher A29 was found in a parallel MI6 file concerning Nazi gold transfers through Swiss banks. The deeper researchers dug, the more the official narrative unraveled. By the early 2000s, only fragments of Ashcroft's original 1945 reports survived. One sheet, recovered from a private estate auction in Kent, bore his handwritten line, "The Iron Cross is not a symbol, it's a blueprint." In a later annotation, dated March 1952, he added, "America got the scientists, someone else got the ideology." If the Iron Cross conspiracy was real, it wasn't just about individuals escaping justice. It was about preserving an entire operational infrastructure under new ownership. Post-war power, in this interpretation, was not divided by victors and vanquished, but by who controlled the knowledge, money, and men capable of continuing the machinery of totalitarian research. The remaining question lingers in intelligence archives still sealed under national security exemptions. Why were the Iron Cross documents reclassified in the 1960s, 2 decades after the war's end? What secret demanded silence even as the world confronted the Cold War's ideological clash? Somewhere, buried in the redacted correspondence of Operation Paperclip, lies the uncomfortable answer that in the rush to secure the future, the West inherited more than the enemy's science. It inherited their system. Chapter 3, Project Lodestar, the Arctic Listening Posts. On the frozen coast of northwestern Greenland, between the cliffs of Dundasfjeld and the icy reaches of Volstenholm Fjord, an unmarked installation once hummed with a signal so faint it barely broke the Arctic static. To the outside world, it was listed as a meteorological observation post under the Danish-American Defense Agreement of 1953. In truth, it was a node in one of the most secret surveillance networks of the early Cold War, Project Lodestar. Its purpose was not to study weather, but to listen, to intercept Soviet submarine transmissions that bounced across the ionosphere, slipping through the polar atmosphere's natural corridors. Construction began in the summer of 1952 under the codename CAMP, Northwind. U.S. Army engineers from the 818th Signal Battalion arrived aboard the USNS Port Littleton, with crates marked radio calibration equipment. Within 3 months, a grid of 27 antenna masts rose from the permafrost, arranged in concentric circles like the ribs of a steel skeleton. Beneath them, sealed beneath layers of insulated tunnels, were 2 structures the men referred to as the galleries, long, dimly lit corridors filled with oscilloscopes, reel-to-reel recorders, and frequency analyzers. The civilian meteorologists who occasionally visited Thule Air Base were told that Lodestar was conducting atmospheric ionization tests. They never saw the galleries. By 1960, the base's official name had changed to Arctic Communications Research Facility No. 3. Its personnel, drawn from the U.S. Air Force Security Service and National Security Agency, operated under false civilian identities. Mail addressed to their families was routed through a dummy P.O. box in Maryland. The intercept teams worked 12-hour shifts, monitoring low-frequency bursts believed to originate from Soviet Northern Fleet subs moving beneath the polar ice. Much of the data was forwarded via encrypted telex to Fort Meade, where it was catalogued under a separate project tag, Polar Noise Analysis. Then, in January 1968, disaster struck nearby. A US B-52 bomber carrying 4 nuclear warheads crashed into the ice 16 kilometers west of Thule Air Base. The world was told it was an accident caused by an onboard fire. What no report mentioned was that Lodestar's radar logs recorded an unknown signal 3 minutes before the crash, an electromagnetic pulse that spiked across the facility's entire bandwidth. The spike was so powerful it burned through 2 main receivers and temporarily blinded the primary communications array. Engineers described the reading as synthetic, not environmental. Within hours, Project Lodestar was placed under code black containment, and all transmissions from the site ceased. The cleanup operation that followed, codenamed Crested Ice, was supposed to recover radioactive debris from the crash, but the men deployed to the site included not only nuclear specialists, but also intelligence officers from the Defense Communications Agency. They were instructed to recover classified electronics from beneath the ice near Camp Northwind, equipment never listed among the bomber's cargo. Witnesses from the Thule civilian workforce later reported seeing large metallic containers airlifted south aboard unmarked C-141 transports. The manifests were blank except for a single line. Material Lodestar Annex. After the accident, official records claimed the station had been decommissioned and dismantled. Yet, in 1974, a Danish geophysicist conducting magnetometric surveys detected a persistent thermal anomaly at the site coordinates. Satellite imagery from 1981 still showed faint grid outlines, antenna shadows that should not have existed. A confidential memo from the US Defense Mapping Agency, released under FOIA in 2011, confirmed that a limited presence remained operational in the Thule sector until at least 1972. It noted, Project Lodestar transitioned to passive relay mode, automated operations sustained via self-contained power source. In the mid-1980s, fragments of intercepted Soviet naval transmissions began circulating among amateur radio enthusiasts in Finland and Norway. One recording, analyzed by cryptographers in Helsinki, contained a distinct low-frequency pulse pattern that matched Lodestar's archival signal template. If true, it meant the installation was still active, decades after being declared abandoned. The mystery deepened when a former US Navy intelligence officer, Commander Alan J. Fielding, disclosed that Lodestar's final mission log had been removed from NSA archives in 1970. Those files weren't destroyed, Fielding told an interviewer in 1993. They were transferred to the Defense Intelligence Special Projects Division, the same office that handled recovered Soviet radar systems. Declassified fragments later revealed what the US had feared most: that Soviet submarines had developed a new form of low-frequency communication using geomagnetic resonance to send encrypted messages under the ice. Lodestar's true role had been to map these resonance fields and locate transmission points. The 1968 Pulse event may have been an intentional countermeasure, a Soviet test to disrupt American signal interception by overloading polar radio channels. But another possibility, whispered in internal memos, was far more unsettling: that the pulse came from Lodestar itself, triggered by an automated failsafe buried deep beneath the ice. In 1999, a joint Danish-American geological survey detected unnatural metallic reflections 90 meters below the surface, where Camp Northwind once stood. The survey team reported their findings to Thule Command, but received no authorization to drill. 3 months later, a classified American satellite overpass captured new thermal readings, patterns resembling buried conduits still generating residual heat. When independent journalists requested satellite copies under the US Open Skies Treaty, the images were quietly reclassified for reasons of national security. Today, only fragments of Project Lodestar's existence remain: partial construction logs, a handful of signal graphs, and 3 decrypted telexes preserved in the National Archives Annex II collection. The final telex, dated February 12, 1968, reads, "Transmitting sequence ceased. Energy anomaly persists. Containment procedure active." Its signature line, "Captain W.L. Cormack, Field Control," appears nowhere else in US military personnel records. Whatever Lodestar intercepted in those Arctic skies was deemed too valuable or too dangerous to destroy. The silence that followed the Thule crash was not the end of the project. It was the beginning of its burial. Somewhere beneath the shifting ice, sealed within frozen concrete and forgotten frequencies, the machinery of Project Lodestar may still be listening, its antennas long buried but not dead, waiting for a signal that no longer belongs to any nation. Chapter 4. Operation Morgenstern, the lost convoy to Odessa, March 1946. The war was over, but the Baltic remained a graveyard of secrets. Ice still clung to the Gulf of Finland as a Soviet naval flotilla departed from the ruins of Königsberg, bound for the Black Sea, under sealed orders from the People's Commissariat for Defense. The mission's name, Operation Morgenstern, appeared in no official Soviet logbooks until 1957, when fragments of the directive surfaced in a Polish intelligence archive. The orders were explicit: transfer confiscated German scientific equipment, secured from underground research sites in East Prussia, to the Odessa naval yards for cataloguing. What they concealed was the true nature of that cargo. The convoy consisted of 6 ships: the Kirovets, Leningradskaya, Voroshilovsk, Tobolsk, Severny III, and Ilyich. Onboard manifests listed industrial machinery and experimental apparatuses. Each ship was escorted by a patrol corvette of the Soviet Baltic Fleet's 2nd Division. The Kirovets, a former German freighter renamed under Soviet command, was the convoy's lead vessel. carrying an engineering detachment under Captain Mikhail Rogov. Soviet sources claim it departed Königsberg on March 17th and never reached its destination. Of the 6 ships, only 2, the Voroshilovsk and Ilyich, arrived at Odessa on April 2nd. The remaining 4 disappeared without distress calls, radar contact, or wreckage. Officially, Moscow's explanation was simple. An unexpected storm event in the Baltic Sea caused multiple losses. The area was declared hazardous and closed to civilian navigation for 2 weeks. Yet decrypted OSS intercepts from that same period tell a different story. Allied monitoring posts in Denmark recorded radio chatter consistent with a Soviet fleet under pursuit. The transmissions mention foreign shadows following from the direction of Bornholm Island. One fragment, translated and stored under US Army Signal Intelligence File 332A, includes the line, "Enemy aircraft above Convoy. No markings, not ours." By 1948, US Naval Intelligence compiled a secret assessment labeled Baltic Incident Review No. 7 Poise. It referenced an unacknowledged engagement involving Soviet cargo, vessels and unidentified Allied craft operating under post-war seizure protocols. The review hypothesized that the cargo aboard the Kirovets included advanced German reactor prototypes developed by Kammler's SS technical divisions, equipment linked to the Uran-Maschine B program, a failed attempt at small-scale nuclear propulsion. Soviet scientists had reportedly extracted these devices from subterranean chambers near Nordhausen and Peenemünde before dismantling the sites to hide their existence. The trail of Operation Morgenstern then went dark until 1952, when a classified CIA diving operation recovered fragments of a ship's hull off Denmark's west coast. The recovered sections bore Cyrillic markings partially reading Kirov. Analysts concluded they belonged to the Kirovets. Inside the wreckage, divers found metal cylinders coated with a crystallized residue that registered faintly radioactive. The operation, codenamed Deep Tide, was halted abruptly. A memo from the State Department dated October 1952 instructed, "Cease further underwater recovery in designated sector. Defer to Atomic Energy Commission jurisdiction." The area was subsequently marked as restricted due to residual contamination. Soviet archives, opened briefly in the early 1990s, contain one entry referring to Morgenstern. The March 2010, 1946 log of Rear Admiral Sergei P. Kolchak mentions special transport missing, presumed sunk. Cargo classified under Directive 12-9, Energy Research Objects. Recovery attempt prohibited. Researchers later discovered that Directive 12-9 corresponded to a sealed Kremlin project involving captured German physicists transferred to Moscow's Laboratory No. 2, the same group that developed the USSR's first reactor at Obninsk. The implication was unmistakable. Morgenstern's cargo may have included components crucial to the Soviet atomic effort. Still, questions persist about the missing ships. Danish fishermen in the late 1940s reported sighting glowing wrecks beneath shallow waters near Bornholm. Swedish naval patrols logged unexplained magnetic anomalies along the convoy's supposed route. In 1961, the Swedish Defense Research Agency deployed a submersible to the site and retrieved fragments of lead shielding and glass tubes filled with metallic debris. The samples were confiscated by NATO intelligence and never returned. Unofficially, the divers were told they had stumbled upon Cold War waste. The only surviving Soviet testimony came from a single sailor, Petty Officer Yegor Mishin, who served aboard the Voroshilovsk. Interviewed by East German security in 1953, he described a sudden flash on the horizon on March 19th. It was not lightning. The sea rose like boiling water. Then a white mist swallowed the Kirovets. He claimed that immediately afterward, their ship's compasses spun uncontrollably and the radio emitted a constant hum until all systems were shut down. His report was sealed by the KGB and declassified only in 1992. Western analysts who reviewed it suggested that the description matched an electromagnetic pulse event. In 1968, British naval historian Peter Garvey located an unmarked storage crate in a London defence archive. Inside were corroded reels of film labelled Morgenstern, Königsberg 1946. The footage, though damaged, showed Soviet officers inspecting cylindrical equipment with German stenciling, Kraftwerk Aptins 47. The insignia corresponded to a secret SS research division tasked with high-output turbine reactors for underwater propulsion. The existence of such reactors was long denied by both German and Soviet sources, yet their blueprints, later found in a Moscow archive, bear Kamler's initials. By the late 1970s, rumors of Morgenstern cargo began to circulate within Soviet naval circles. Some officers whispered that one of the missing ships had been secretly salvaged and moved to Sevastopol under heavy guard. Another claimed the Convoy never sank at all, that it was intercepted and its cargo divided between Western and Soviet intelligence in a covert post-war exchange. No proof has ever surfaced, though discrepancies in US atomic research documentation from 1947 to 1948, especially unexplained test data on compact reactor shielding, lend weight to the theory that at least part of the cargo reached American hands. Modern sonar mapping conducted in 2006 by a joint Polish-Danish expedition rediscovered a large metallic structure 220 meters beneath the Baltic's floor. Measuring 150 feet long, it matches the dimensions of the Kirovets. The team reported abnormally high radiation levels and suspended further dives. Within months, the wreck site was reclassified by the Danish Maritime Authority at the request of NATO. The expedition's data drives were seized under mutual defense agreements if Operation Morgenstern was merely a post-war transport mission. Its secrecy makes little sense. Its disappearance, however, aligns perfectly with an era defined by the hunger for German scientific spoils and the willingness of both East and West to conceal the origins of their technological leaps. Somewhere beneath the Baltic, encased in silt and secrecy, the final resting place of the Kirovets may still hold the blueprints of a technology never meant to exist. And if the rumors of recovered reactors are true, the world's atomic balance may have been forged not in Los Alamos or Alzheimer's 16, but in the cold, black depths of the Baltic Sea. Chapter 5. The Wolfen Archive. Signals from the Reich Chancellery. Berlin, winter 1944. Allied bombers scorched the capital by night, and by day, the SS burned documents faster than they could print them. In the bowels of the Reich Chancellery, behind reinforced concrete and steel, an experimental signal unit operated from a small, windowless chamber beneath the main communications wing. Officially, it was the Führerhauptquartier Nachrichtenstelle, an auxiliary message center. But according to decrypted British intercepts, it broadcast on frequencies far outside the standard Luftwaffe spectrum. These transmissions, signed only with the cipher tag Wolfen, were first detected by a listening post in Cheltenham in February 1945. They emanated not from the front lines, but from beneath Berlin itself. British signal analysts were baffled. The pulse length, frequency drift, and coded intervals did not match Enigma or Lorenz cipher patterns. When a captured German radio man was questioned in April 1945, he referred to Wolfen, not a place, but the signal name of the Führer's shadow channel. He described it as a backdoor communications network designed to transmit emergency orders directly to loyalist units in Austria and Bavaria if Berlin fell. Yet, after May 2, 1945, the official date of Berlin's surrender, those signals continued. Intermittent bursts were recorded as late as May 8th, originating from the same coordinates, unter den Linden 77, the exact location of the destroyed Chancellery. In 1947, during Allied reconstruction, a team of Royal Engineers conducting excavation beneath the Chancellery ruins discovered a sealed door. Behind it lay a concrete chamber approximately 30 meters below street level. Inside were rusted switchboards, generator housings, and, remarkably, an array of experimental telegraphy devices wired to copper conduits embedded in the walls. None connected to surface cables. The equipment bore Siemens and Telefunken serials with 1944 manufacture dates. On one wall, in chalk, a single phrase had been scrawled, Nachricht bleibt. The message remains. The site was photographed, logged, and sealed under British military government jurisdiction. Within months, the entire find was classified under the codename the Wolfen Archive. The artifacts were shipped to a depot near Göttingen for analysis, where engineers from MI5 and the US Army Signal Corps attempted to reconstruct the system. Their conclusion was unnerving. The transmitters had been tuned to frequencies capable of bouncing signals off the upper ionosphere, effectively creating long-distance communication loops that could persist even after the original power source failed, if certain magnetic conditions were met. In simpler terms, the system could, under rare atmospheric alignments, continue broadcasting echoes of its own transmission pattern. In 1951, British cryptographic experts revisited stored Wolfen equipment and discovered that several vacuum tubes had not decayed as expected. When powered under controlled conditions, one receiver produced a faint rhythmic pulse, a pattern identical to the final Wolfen transmission recorded in May 1945. It repeated every 31 seconds for nearly 2 minutes before ceasing. The event was documented in a restricted memorandum titled Acoustic Residue Phenomenon, Wolfen Chamber. The device was immediately dismantled and sealed again. The mystery might have ended there, had it not been for a curious discovery in 1971. During a routine inventory purge at MI5's Kensington storage facility, a clerk found an unlabeled reel-to-reel tape inside a steel cabinet. Its label read, "Wolfen Archive, do not duplicate." The recording, examined at the BBC Radiophonic Laboratory, contained low-frequency bursts between 14 and 18 kHz, barely audible to the human ear. When filtered, the signal resolved into short waveforms resembling Morse, though no known cipher matched. The analysts noted that the pulse strength increased precisely on the anniversary of Hitler's death, April 30th. The source was unknown. The BBC engineer assigned to the test later told a journalist, "It wasn't interference. It was like a heartbeat made of code." Attempts to triangulate the modern origin of the Wolfen signal in the 1970s yielded conflicting results. One NATO surveillance sweep registered bursts near Peenemünde, another off the Austrian Alps. The most persistent emissions, however, still traced faintly back to Berlin. In 1984, during renovations near Wilhelmstrasse, workers unearthed another segment of the Chancellery's underground cable system. The cables terminated in a sealed conduit labelled Nachtricht Kanal 4. Soviet military engineers present at the site insisted the area be sealed immediately, citing hazardous materials. Within days, the tunnel was filled with concrete. In 1990, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, new excavation efforts finally allowed historians access to declassified British and Soviet post-war files. Among them were fragments from the Wolfen Archive Report No. 6. It included a map of the Chancellery's lowest sublevel, annotated with symbols indicating radioisotopic relay chambers. Some researchers speculated that Wolfen's equipment was powered by experimental mercury arc rectifiers, a technology the Nazis explored for long-range radar synchronization. If true, it would explain the recurring emissions decades later. Residual electrical activity trapped in conductive mediums buried beneath the ruins. But one final piece of evidence emerged in 2009, when a retired Bundeswehr communications officer released digitized versions of long-suppressed Soviet intercept logs. One entry, dated June 1956, describes anomalous Morse-type activity on frequency 15.1 kHz, duration 47 seconds. Source coordinates correspond with old Reichskanzlei. The analyst's notation read simply, Wolfen. For the first time, a second independent record confirmed that the transmissions had continued years after Berlin's fall. Modern theories vary. Some claim the Wolfen frequency was an automated distress beacon inadvertently reactivated by magnetic shifts. Others argue it was an early prototype of signal redundancy communications, designed to survive Germany's defeat by repeating pre-encoded directives long after the operators were gone. A darker interpretation, circulated in intelligence circles during the early Cold War, suggested that Wolfen carried encrypted bank codes and offshore transfers linked to hidden Nazi reserves. In that version, the broadcasts were not echoes at all, but ongoing transmissions from a successor network that continued the Reich's operations under new identities abroad. Whatever the truth, the Wolfen Archive remains one of the most disturbing remnants of the Third Reich's technological desperation. Beneath the concrete of modern Berlin, the sealed tunnels still hum faintly when tested with sensitive electromagnetic equipment. Locals call it the underground whisper. Engineers say it's simply power line interference, yet on some nights, especially around late April, the frequency spikes briefly, precisely at 15.1 kHz, and a pattern of dots and dashes flickers through the static. Decades after the war's end, the message remains, repeating from a chamber no one dares reopen. Whether it's a mechanical ghost or a forgotten signal still running on its last current, the Wolfen transmission endures as a reminder. not all of Berlin's dead voices have gone silent. By the time the last Soviet officer signed the ceasefire papers and the victors wrote their own versions of history, the truth had already begun to vanish. Files were burned, witnesses disappeared, and whole operations, Eclipse, Iron Cross, Lodestar, Morgenstern, Wolfen, were quietly folded into new agendas beneath new governments. Each story led deeper into the same conclusion. The war never really ended. It only changed its name, its laboratories, and its language. Somewhere in forgotten archives and sealed bunkers, those documents still wait. Evidence of a conflict waged not for borders, but for control of knowledge itself. And as long as those records remain hidden, the shadows of that era will continue to whisper, reminding us that history's silence is never empty, it's engineered.